Chapter 9 of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 9. The Autumn Vacation. The last day of the term was one of confusion. Every part of the house was given over to trunks and packing. Mrs. Nipson sat at her desk making out bills and listening to requests about rooms and roommates. Miss Jane counted books and atlases, taking note of each ink spot in dog-eared page. The girls ran about, searching for missing articles, deciding what to take home and what to leave, engaging each other for the winter walks. All rules were laid aside. The sober nunnery seemed turned into a hive of buzzing bees. Bella slid twice down the baluster from the front stairs without being reproved, and Rose Red threw her arm around Katy's waist and waltzed the whole length of Quaker Row. "I am so happy that I should like to scream," she announced, as their last whirl brought them up against the wall. "Isn't vacation just lovely? Katy, you don't look half glad." "We're not going home, you know," replied Katy in a rather doleful tone. She and Clover were not so enraptured at the coming of vacation as the rest of the girls. Spending a month with Mrs. Paige and Lily was by no means the same thing as spending it with Papa and the children. Next morning, however, when the big stage drove up and the girls crowded in, when Mrs. Nipson stood in the doorway blandly waving farewell, and the maids flourished their dusters out of the upper windows, they found themselves sharing the general excitement and joining heartily in the cheer which arose as the stage moved away. The girls felt so happy and good-natured that some of them even kissed their hands to Miss Jane. Such a wild company is not often met with on a railroad train. They all went together as far as the junction, and Mr. Gray, Ellen's father, who had been put in charge of the party by Mrs. Nipson, had his hands full to keep them in any sort of order. He was a timid old gentleman, and, as Rose suggested, his expression resembled that of a sedate hen who suddenly finds herself responsible for the conduct of a brood of ducklings. My dear," he feebly remonstrated, "would you buy any more candy? Do you not think so many peanuts may be bad for you?" "Oh, no, sir," replied Rose. "They never hurt me a bit. I can eat thousands." Then, as a stout lady entered the car and made a motion toward the vacant seat beside her, she rolled her eyes wildly and said, "Excuse me, but perhaps I had better take the end seat so as to get out easily in case I have a fit." "Fits!" cried the stout lady, and walked away with the utmost dispatch. Rose gave a wicked chuckle, the girls tittered, and Mr. Gray visibly trembled. "Is she really affected in this way?" he whispered. "Oh, no, Papa, it's only Rose's nonsense," apologized Ellen, who was laughing as hard as the rest. But Mr. Gray did not feel comfortable, and he was very glad when they reached the junction and half of his troublesome charge departed on the branch road. At 6 o'clock they arrived in Springfield. Half a dozen papas were waiting for their daughters, trains stood ready, there was a clamor of good-byes. Mr. Paige was absorbed by Lily, who kissed him incessantly and chattered so fast that he had no eyes for anyone else. Louisa was borne away by an uncle, with whom she was to pass the night, and Katy and Clover found themselves left alone. They did not like to interrupt Lily, so they retreated to a bench and sat down feeling rather left out and homesick, and though they did not say so, I am sure that each was thinking about Papa. It was only for a moment. Mr. Paige spied them and came up with such a kind greeting that the forlorn feeling fled at once. They were to pass the night at the Massasoit, it seemed, and he collected their bags and led the way across the street to the hotel, where rooms were already engaged for them. "Now for waffles," whispered Lily as they went upstairs, and when, after a few minutes of washing and brushing, they came down again into the dining room, she called for so many things, and announced herself starved in such a tragical tone, that two amused waiters at once flew to the rescue and devoted themselves to supplying her wants. Waffle after waffle, each hotter and crisper than the last, did those long-suffering men produce, till even Lily's appetite gave out, and she was forced to own that she could not swallow another morsel. This climax reached, they went into the parlor, and the girls sat down in the window to watch the people in the street, which, after quiet Hillsover, looked as brilliant and crowded as Broadway. There were not many persons in the parlor. A grave-looking couple sat at a table at some distance, and a pretty little boy in a velvet jacket was playing around the room. He seemed about 5 years old, and Katy, who was fond of children, put out her hand as he went by, caught him, and lifted him into her lap. He did not seem shy, but looked her in the face composedly, like a grown person. "What is your name, dear?" she asked. "Daniel Daubigny Sparks," answered the little boy. His voice was prim and distinct. "Do you live at this hotel?" "Yes, ma'am. I reside here with my father and my mother." "And what do you do all day? Are there some other little boys for you to play with?" "I do not wish to play with any little boys," replied Daniel Daubigny in a dignified tone. "I prefer to be with my parents. Today we have taken a walk. We went to see a beautiful conservatory outside the city. There is a Victoria Regia there. I had often heard of this wonderful lily, and in the last number of the London Musee there is a picture of it, represented with a small negro child standing upon one of its leaves. My father said that he did not think this is possible, but when we saw the plant we perceived that the print was not an exaggeration. Such is the size of the leaf that a small negro child might very easily be supported upon it." "Oh, my!" cried Katy, feeling as if she had accidentally picked up an elderly gentleman or a college professor. "Pray, how old are you?" "Nearly 9, ma'am," replied the little fellow with a bow. Katy, too much appalled for further speech, let him slide off her lap. But Mr. Paige, who was much diverted, continued the conversation, and Daniel, mounting a chair, crossed his short legs and discoursed with all the gravity of an old man. The talk was principally about himself, his tastes, his adventures, his ideas about art and science. Now and then he alluded to his papa and mamma, and once to his grandfather. "My maternal grandfather," he said, "was a remarkable man. In his youth he spent a great deal of time in France. He was there at the time of the French Revolution, and, as it happened, was present at the execution of the unfortunate Queen Marie Antoinette. This, of course, was not intentional. It chanced thus. My grandfather was in a barber's shop, having his hair cut. He saw a great crowd going by, and went out to ask what was the cause. The crowd was so immense that he could not extricate himself. He was carried along against his will, and not only so, but was forced to the front and compelled to witness every part of the dreadful scene. He has often told my mother that, after the execution, the executioner held up the queen's head to the people. The eyes were open, and there was in them an expression, not of pain, not of fear, but of great astonishment and surprise." This anecdote carried great astonishment and surprise into the company who listened to it. Mr. Paige gave a sort of chuckle, and saying, "By George," got up and left the room. The girls put their heads out of the window that they might laugh unseen. Daniel gazed at their shaking shoulders with an air of wonder, while the grave couple at the end of the room, who for some moments had been looking disturbed, drew near and informed the youthful prodigy that it was time for him to go to bed. "Good night, young ladies," said the small, condescending voice. Katy alone had presence of countenance enough to return this salutation. It was a relief to find that Daniel went to bed at all. Next morning at breakfast they saw him seated between his parents, eating bread and milk. He bowed to them over the edge of the bowl. "Dreadful little prig! They should bottle him in spirits of wine as a specimen. It's the only thing he'll ever be fit for," remarked Mr. Paige, who rarely said so sharp a thing about anybody. Louisa joined them at the station. She was to travel under Mr. Page's care, and Katy was much annoyed at Lily's manner with her. It grew colder and less polite with every mile. By the time they reached Ashburn it was absolutely rude. "Come and see me very soon, girls," said Louisa as they parted in the station. "I long to have you know mother and little Daisy. Oh, there's papa!" And she rushed up to a tall, pleasant-looking man, who kissed her fondly, shook hands with Mr. Page, and touched his hat to Lily, who scarcely bowed in return. "Boarding school is so horrid," she remarked. "You get all mixed up with people you don't want to know, people not in society at all." "How can you talk such nonsense?" said her father. "The Agnus are thoroughly respectable, and Mr. Agnew is one of the cleverest men I know." Katy was pleased when Mr. Page said this, but Lily shrugged her shoulders and looked cross. "Papa is so democratic," she whispered to Clover. "He don't care a bit who people are, so long as they are respectable and clever." "Well, why should he?" replied Clover. Lily was more disgusted than ever. Ashburn was a large and prosperous town. It was built on the slopes of a picturesque hill, and shaded with fine elms. As they drove through the streets, Katy and Clover caught glimpses of conservatories and shrubberies, and beautiful houses with bay windows and piazzas. "That's ours," said Lily, as the carriage turned in at a gate. It stopped, and Mr. Page jumped out. "Here we are," he said. "Gently, Lily, you'll hurt yourself. Well, my dears, we're very glad to see you in our home at last." This was kind and comfortable, and the girls were glad of it, for the size and splendor of the house quite dazzled and made them shy. They had never seen anything like it before. The hall had a marble floor, and busts and statues. Large rooms opened on either side. "This is the drawing-room," said Lily, delighted to see the girls looking so impressed. "Isn't it splendid?" And she led the way into a stiff, chilly, magnificent apartment where all the blinds were closed, and all the shades pulled down, and all the furniture shrouded in linen covers. Even the picture frames and mirrors were sewn up in muslin to keep off flies, and the bronzes and alabaster ornaments on the chimney-piece and etagere gleamed through the dim light in a ghostly way. Katy thought it very dismal. She couldn't imagine anybody sitting down there to read or sew or do anything pleasant, and probably it was not intended that any one should do so, for Mrs. Paige soon showed them out and led the way into a smaller room at the back of the hall. "Well, Katy," she said, "how do you like Hillsover?" "Very well, ma'am," replied Katy, but she did not speak enthusiastically. "Ah," said Mrs. Paige, shaking her head, "it takes time to shake off home habits and to learn to get along with young people after living with older ones and catching their ways. You'll like it better as you go on." Katy privately doubted whether this was true, but she did not say so. Pretty soon Lily offered to show them upstairs to their room. She took them first into 3 large and elegant chambers, which she explained were kept for grand company, and then into a much smaller one in a wing. "Mother always puts my friends in here," she remarked. "She says it's plenty good enough for schoolgirls to thrash about in." "What does she mean?" cried Clover indignantly as Lily closed the door. "We don't thrash." "I can't imagine," answered Katy, who was vexed too. But pretty soon she began to laugh. "People are so funny," she said. "Never mind, Clovy, this room is good enough, I'm sure." "Must we unpack, or will it do to go down in our alpacas?" asked Clover. "I don't know," replied Katy in a doubtful tone. "Perhaps we had better change our gowns. Cousin Olivia always dresses so much. Here's your blue muslin right on top of the trunk. You might put on that, and I'll wear my purple." The girls were glad they had done this, for it was evidently expected, and Lily had dressed her hair and donned a fresh white peak. Mrs. Paige examined their dresses and said that Clover's was a lovely blue, but that ruffles were quite gone out, and everything must be made with basques. She supposed they needed quantities of things, and she had already engaged a dressmaker to work for them. "Thank you," said Katy, "but I don't think we need anything. We had our winter dresses made before we left home." "Winter dresses? Last spring? My dear, what were you thinking of? They must be completely out of fashion." "You can't think how little Hillsover people know about fashions," replied Katy, laughing. "But, my dear, for your own sake," exclaimed Mrs. Paige, distressed by these lax remarks. "I'll look over your things tomorrow and see what you need." Katy did not dare to say no, but she felt rebellious. When they were half through tea the door opened and a boy came in. "You are late, Clarence," said Mr. Paige, while Mrs. Paige groaned and observed, "Clarence makes a point of being late. He really deserves to be made to go without his supper. Shut the door, Clarence. Oh, mercy, don't bang it in that way. I wish you would learn to shut a door properly. Here are your cousins, Katy and Clover Carr. Now let me see if you can shake hands with them like a gentleman and not like a plowboy." Clarence, a square, freckled boy of 13, with reddish hair and a sort of red sparkle in his eyes, looked very angry at this address. He did not offer to shake hands at all, but elevating his shoulders, said, "How do you do?" in a sulky voice, and sitting down at the table, buried his nose without delay in a glass of milk. His mother gave a disgusted sigh. "What a boy you are," she said. "Your cousins will think that you have never been taught anything, which is not the case, for I'm sure I've taken twice the pains with you that I have with Lily. Pray excuse him, Katy. It's no use trying to make boys polite." "Isn't it?" said Katy, thinking of Phil and Dorry, and wondering what Mrs. Paige could mean. "Hello, Lily," broke in Clarence, spying his sister as it seemed for the first time. "How do you do?" said Lily carelessly. "I was wondering how long it would be before you would condescend to notice my existence." "I didn't see you." "I know you didn't. I never knew such a boy. You might as well have no eyes at all." Clarence scowled and went on with his supper. His mother seemed unable to let him alone. "Clarence, don't take such large mouthfuls. Clarence, pray use your napkin. Clarence, your elbows are on the table, sir. Now, Clarence, don't try to speak until you have swallowed all that bread," came every other moment. Katy felt very sorry for Clarence. His manners were certainly bad, but it seemed quite dreadful that public attention should be thus constantly called to them. The evening was rather dull. There was a sort of put in order for company air about the parlor, which made everybody stiff. Mrs. Paige did not sew or read, but sat in a low chair looking like a lady in a fashion plate, and asked questions about Hillsover, some of which were not easy to answer, as, for example, "Have you any other intimate friends among the schoolgirls besides Lily?" About 8 o'clock a couple of young, very young, gentlemen came in, at the sight of whom Lily, who was half asleep, brightened and became lively and talkative. One of them was the Mr. Hickman whose father married Mr. Page's sister-in-law's sister, thus making him in some mysterious way a first cousin of Lily's. He was an Arrowmouth student, and seemed to have so many jokes to laugh over with Lily that before long they conversed in whispers. The other youth, introduced as Mr. Eales, was left to entertain the other three ladies, which duty he performed by sucking the head of his cane in silence while they talked to him. He too was an Arrowmouth sophomore. In the midst of the conversation the door, which stood ajar, opened a little wider, and a dog's head appeared, followed by a tail, which waggled so beseechingly for leave to come farther that Clover, who liked dogs, put out her hand at once. He was not pretty, being of a pepper and salt color, with a blunt nose and no particular sort of a tail, but he looked good-natured, and Clover fondled him cordially, while Mr. Eales took his cane out of his mouth to ask, "What kind of a dog is that, Mrs. Page?" "I'm sure I don't know," she replied, while Lily from the distance added affectedly, "Oh, he's the most dreadful dog, Mr. Eales. My brother picked him up in the street, and none of us know the least thing about him, except that he is the commonest kind of dog, a sort of cur, I believe." "That's not true," broke in a stern voice from the hall, which made everybody jump, and Katy, looking that way, was aware of a vengeful eye glaring at Lily through the crack of the door. "He's a very valuable dog indeed, half mastiff and half terrier, with a touch of the bulldog. So there, miss." The effect of this remark was startling. Lily gave a scream, Mrs. Page rose and hurried to the door, while the dog, hearing his master's voice, rushed that way also, got before her, and almost threw her down. Katy and Clover could not help laughing, and Mr. Eales, meeting their amused eyes, removed the cane from his mouth and grew conversable. "That Clarence is a droll chap," he remarked confidentially. "Bright, too. He'd be a nice fellow if he wasn't picked at so much. It never does a fellow any good to be picked at, now does it, Miss Carr?" "No, I don't think it does." "I say," continued Mr. Eales, "I've seen you young ladies up at Hillsover, haven't I? Aren't you both at the nunnery?" "Yes, it's vacation now, you know." "I was sure I'd seen you. You had a room on the side next the president's, didn't you?" "I thought so. We fellows didn't know your names, so we called you the real nuns." "Real nuns?" "Yes, because you never looked out of the window at us. Real nuns and sham nuns, don't you see? Almost all the young ladies are sham nuns, except you, and two pretty little ones in the story above, fifth window from the end." "Oh, I know," said Clover, much amused. "Sally Alsop, you know, Katy, and Amy Erskine. They're such nice girls." "Are they?" replied Mr. Eales, with the air of one who notes down names for future reference. "Well, I thought so. Not so much fun in them as some of the others, I guess, but a fellow likes other things as well as fun. I know if my sister was there I'd rather have her take the dull line than the other." Katy treasured up this remark for the benefit of the S.S.U.C. Mrs. Page came back just then, and Mr. Eales resumed his cane. Nothing more was heard of Clarence that night. Next morning Cousin Olivia fulfilled her threat of inspecting the girls' wardrobe. She shook her head over the simple, untrimmed merinos and thick cloth coats. "There's no help for it," she said, "but it's a great pity. You would much better have waited, and had things fresh. Perhaps it may be possible to match the merino and have some sort of basque arrangement added on. I will talk to Madame Chamfleur about it. Meantime, I shall get one handsome thick dress for each of you, and have it stylishly made. That, at least, you really need." Katy was too glad to be so easily let off to raise objections. So that afternoon she and Clover were taken out to choose their material, Mrs. Page said, but really to sit by while she chose it for them. At the dressmaker's it was the same. They stood passive while the orders were given and everything decided upon. "Isn't it funny?" whispered Clover. "But I don't like it a bit, do you? It's just like Elsie saying how she'll have her doll's things made." "Oh, this dress isn't mine. It's Cousin Olivia's," replied Katy. "She's welcome to have it trimmed just as she likes." But when the suits came home she was forced to be pleased. There was no over-trimming, no look of finery, everything fitted perfectly, and had the air of finish which she had noticed and admired in Lily's clothes. Katy almost forgot that she had objected to the dresses as unnecessary. "After all, it is nice to look nice," she confessed to Clover. Excepting going to the dressmaker's, there was not much to amuse the girls during the first half of vacation. Mrs. Page took them to drive now and then, and Katy found some pleasant books in the library, and read a good deal. Clover, meantime, made friends with Clarence. I think his heart was won that first evening by her attentions to Guest, the dog, that mysterious composite, half mastiff and half terrier with a touch of the bulldog. Clarence loved Guest dearly, and was gratified that Clover liked him, for the poor animal had few friends in the household. In a little while Clarence became quite sociable with her, and tolerably so with Katy. They found him, as Mr. Eel said, a bright fellow, and pleasant and good-humored enough when taken in the right way. Lily always seemed to take him wrong, and his treatment of her was most disagreeable, snappish and quarrelsome to the last degree. "Much you don't like oranges," he said one day at dinner, in answer to an innocent remark of hers. "Much! I've seen you eat 2 at a time without stopping. Pa, Lily says she don't like oranges. I've seen her eat 2 at a time without stopping. Much she doesn't. I've seen her eat 2 at a time without stopping." He kept this up for 5 minutes, looking from one person to another, and repeating, "Much she don't, much!" till Lily was almost crying from vexation, and even Clover longed to box his ears. Nobody was sorry when Mr. Paige ordered him to leave the room, which he did with a last vindictive "much" addressed to Lily. "How can Clarence behave so?" said Katy, when she and Clover were alone. "I don't know," replied Clover. "He's such a nice boy sometimes, but when he isn't nice, he's the horridest boy I ever saw. I wish you'd talk to him, Katy, and tell him how dreadfully it sounds when he says such things." "No, indeed. He'd take it much better from you. You're nearer his age, and could do it nicely and pleasantly, and not make him feel as if he were being scolded. Poor fellow, he gets plenty of that." Clover said no more about the subject, but she meditated. She had a good deal of tact for so young a girl, and took care to get Clarence into a specially amiable mood before she began her lecture. "Look here, you bad boy, how could you tease poor Lily so yesterday? Guest, speak up, sir, and tell your massa how naughty it was." "Oh, dear, now you're going to nag," growled Clarence in an injured voice. "No, I'm not the least in the world. I'll promise not to. But just tell me," and Clover put her hand on the rough, red-brown hair and stroked it, "just tell me why you go for to do such things. They're not a bit nice." "Lily's so hateful," grumbled Clarence. "Well, she is sometimes, I know," admitted Clover candidly. "But because she is hateful is no reason why you should be unmanly." "Unmanly!" cried Clarence, flushing. "Yes, I call it unmanly to tease and quarrel and contradict like that. It's like girls. They do it sometimes, but I didn't think a boy would. I thought he'd be ashamed." "Doesn't Dorry ever quarrel or tease?" asked Clarence, who liked to hear about Clover's brothers and sisters. "Not now, and never in that way. He used to sometimes when he was little, but now he's real nice. He wouldn't speak to a girl as you speak to Lily for anything in the world. He'd think it wasn't being a gentleman." "Stuff about gentlemen and all that," retorted Clarence. "Mother dings the word in my ears till I hate it." "Well, it is rather teasing to be reminded all the time, I admit. But you can't wonder that your mother wants you to be a gentleman, Clarence. It's the best thing in the world, I think. I hope Phil and Dorry will grow up just like papa, for everybody says he's the most perfect gentleman, and it makes me so proud to hear them." "But what does it mean, anyway? Mother says it's how you hold your fork and how you chew and how you put on your hat. If that's all, I don't think it amounts to much." "Oh, that isn't all. It's being gentle, don't you see? Gentle and nice to everybody, and just as polite to poor people as to rich ones," said Clover, talking fast in her eagerness to explain her meaning. "And never being selfish or noisy or pushing people out of their place. Forks and hats and all that are only little ways of making oneself more agreeable to other people. A gentleman is a gentleman inside, all through. Oh, I wish I could make you see what I mean." "Oh, that's it, is it?" said Clarence. Whether he understood or not, Clover could not tell, or whether she had done any good or not. But she had the discretion to say no more, and certainly Clarence was not offended, for after that day he grew fonder of her than ever. Lily became absolutely jealous. She had never cared particularly for Clarence's affection, but she did not like to have anyone preferred above herself. "It's pretty hard, I think," she told Clover. "Clare does everything you tell him, and he treats me awfully. It isn't a bit fair. I'm his sister, and you're only a second cousin." All this time the girls had seen almost nothing of Louisa Agnew. She called once, but Lily received the call with them, and so cool and stiff that Louisa grew stiff also, and made but a short stay. And when the girls returned the visit she was out. A few days before the close of vacation, however, a note came from her. "Dear Katy, I am so sorry not to have seen more of you and Clover. Won't you come and spend Wednesday with us? Mamma sends her love, and hopes you will come early so as to have a long day, for she wants to know you. I long to show you the baby and everything. Do come. Papa will see you home in the evening. Remember me to Lily. She has so many friends to see during vacation that I am sure she will forgive me for stealing you for one day. Yours affectionately, Louisa." Katy thought this message very politely expressed, but Lily, when she heard it, tossed her head and said she really thought Miss Agnew might let her name alone when she wrote notes. Mrs. Paige seemed to pity the girls for having to go. They must, she supposed, as it was a schoolmate, but she feared it would be stupid for them. The Agnews were queer sort of people, not in society at all. Mr. Agnew was clever, people said, but really she knew very little about the family. Perhaps it would not do to decline. Katy and Clover had no idea of declining. They sent a warm little note of acceptance, and on the appointed day set off bright and early, with a good deal of pleasant anticipation. The vacation had been rather dull at Cousin Olivia's. Lily was a good deal with her own friends, and Mrs. Paige with hers, and there never seemed any special place where they might sit, or anything in particular for them to do. Louisa's home was at some distance from Mr. Page's, and in a less fashionable street. It looked pleasant and cozy as the girls opened the gate. There was a small garden in the front, with gay flower beds, and on the piazza, which was shaded with vines, sat Mrs. Agnew, with a little work table by her side. She was a pretty and youthful-looking woman, and her voice and smile made them feel at home immediately. "There is no need of anybody to introduce you," she said. "Lulu has described you so often that I know perfectly well which is Katy and which is Clover. I am so glad you could come. Won't you go right in my bedroom by that long window and take off your things? Lulu has explained to you that I am lame and never walk, so you won't think it strange that I do not show you the way. She will be here in a moment. She ran upstairs to fetch the baby." The girls went into the bedroom. It was a pretty and unusual-looking apartment. The furniture was simple as could be, but bed and toilet and windows were curtained and frilled with white, and the walls were covered thick with pictures, photographs, and pen-and-ink sketches, and water-color drawings, unframed most of them, and just pinned up without regularity, so as to give each the best possible light. It was an odd way of arranging pictures, but Katy liked it, and would gladly have lingered to look at each one, only that she feared Mrs. Agnew would expect them, and would think it strange that they did not come back. Just as they went out again to the piazza, Louisa came running downstairs with her little sister in her arms. "I was curling her hair," she explained, "and did not hear you come in. Daisy, give Katy a kiss. Now another for Clover. Isn't she a darling?" embracing the child rapturously herself. "Now isn't she a little beauty?" "Perfectly lovely," cried the others, and soon all three were seated on the floor of the piazza, with Daisy in the midst, passing her from hand to hand as if she had been something good to eat. She was used to it, and submitted with perfect good nature to being kissed, trotted, carried up and down, and generally made love to. Mrs. Agnew sat by and laughed at the spectacle. When baby was taken off for her noonday nap, Louisa took the girls into the parlor, another odd and pretty room, full of prints and sketches and pictures of all sorts, some with frames, others with a knot of autumn leaves or a twist of ivy around them by the way of a finish. There was a bowl of beautiful autumn roses on the table, and though the price of one of Mrs. Page's damask curtains would probably have bought the whole furniture of the room, everything was so bright and homelike and pleasant-looking that Katy's heart warmed at the sight. They were examining a portrait of Louisa with Daisy in her lap, painted by her father, when Mr. Agnew came in. The girls liked his face at once. It was fine and frank, and nothing could be prettier than to see him pick up his sweet invalid wife as if she had been a child, and carry her into the dining-room to her place at the head of the table. Katy and Clover agreed afterward that it was the merriest dinner they had had since they left home. Mr. Agnew told stories about painters and painting, and was delightful. No less so was the nice gossip upstairs in Louisa's room, which followed dinner, or the afternoon frolic with Daisy, or the long evening spent in looking over books and photographs. Altogether the day seemed only too short. As they went out of the gate at 10 o'clock, Mr. Agnew following, lo, a dark figure emerged from behind a tree and joined Clover. It was Clarence. "I thought I'd just walk this way," he explained. "The house has been dreadfully dull all day without you." Clover was immensely flattered, but Mrs. Page's astonishment next day knew no bounds. "Really," she said, "I have hopes of Clarence at last. I never knew him volunteer to escort anybody anywhere before in his life." "I say," said Clarence, the evening before the girls went back to school, "I say, suppose you write to a fellow sometimes, Clover." "Do you mean yourself by a fellow?" laughed Clover. "You don't suppose I meant George Hickman or that donkey of an Eales, did you?" retorted Clarence. "No, I didn't." "Well, I have no objection to writing to a fellow if that fellow is you, provided the fellow answers my letters." "Will you?" "Yes," gruffly, "but you mustn't show 'em to any girls, or laugh at my writing, or I'll stop. Lily says my writing is like beetle tracks. Little she knows about it, though. I don't write to her. Promise, Clover?" "Yes, I promise," said Clover, pleased at the notion of Clare's proposing a correspondence of his own accord. Next morning they all left for Hillsover. Clarence's friendship and the remembrance of their day with the Agnus were the pleasantest things that the girls carried away with them from their autumn vacation. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 10. A Budget of Letters. Hillsover, October 21st. Dearest Elsie, I didn't write you last Saturday because that was the day we came back to school, and there hasn't been 1 minute since when I could. We thought perhaps Miss Jane would let us off from the abstracts on Sunday, because it was the first day and school was hardly begun, and if she had I was going to write to you instead, but she didn't. She said the only way to keep girls out of mischief was to keep them busy. Rose Red is sure that something has gone wrong with Miss Jane's missionary during the vacation. She's so dreadfully cross. Oh dear, how I do hate to come back and be scolded by her again. I forget if I told you about the abstracts. They are of the sermons on Sunday, you know, and we have to give the texts and the heads and as much as we can remember of the rest. Sometimes Dr. Prince begins, "I shall divide my subject into 3 parts," and tells what they are going to be. When he does that, most of the girls take out their pencils and put them down, and then they don't listen any more. Katy and I don't, for she says it isn't right not to listen some. Miss Jane pretends that she reads all the abstracts through, but she doesn't. For once Rose Red, just to try her, wrote in the middle of hers, "I am sitting by my window at this moment, and a red cow is going down the street. I wonder if she is any relation to Mrs. Seacombe's cow," and Miss Jane never noticed it, but marked her perfect all the same. Wasn't it funny? But I must tell you about our journey back. Mr. Paige came all the way with us and was ever so nice. Clarence rode down in the carriage to the depot. He gave me a real pretty india rubber and gold pencil for a good-bye present. I think you and Dorry would like Clarence, only just at first you might say he was rather rude and cross. I did, but now I like him ever so much. Cousin Olivia gave Katy a worked collar and sleeves, and me an embroidered pocket handkerchief with clover leaves in the corner. Wasn't it kind? I'm sorry I said in my last letter that we didn't enjoy our vacation. We didn't much, but it wasn't exactly Cousin Olivia's fault. She meant we should, but she didn't know how. Some people don't, you know. And don't tell anyone I said so, will you? Rose Red got here in the train before we did. She was so glad when we came that she cried. It was because she was homesick waiting 4 hours at the nunnery without us, she said. Rose is such a darling. She had a splendid vacation and went to 3 parties and a picnic. Isn't it queer? Her winter bonnet is black velvet trimmed with pink, and so is mine. I wanted blue at first, but Cousin Olivia said pink was more stylish, and now I am glad, because I like to be like Rose. Katy and I have got number 2 this term. It's a good deal pleasanter than our old room, and the entry stove is just outside the door, so we shall keep warm. There is sun, too, only Mrs. Nipson has nailed thick cotton over all the window, except a little place at the top. Every window in the house is just so. You can't think how mad the girls are about it. The first night we had an indignation meeting, and passed resolutions, and some of the girls said they wouldn't stay. They should write to their fathers to come and take them home. None of them did, though. It's perfectly forlorn not being able to look out. Oh dear, how I wish it were spring. We've got a new dining room. It's a great deal bigger than the old one, so now we all eat together, and don't have any first and second tables. It's ever so much nicer, for I used to get so dreadfully hungry waiting that I didn't know what to do. One thing is horrid, though, and that is that every girl has to make a remark in French every day at dinner. The remarks are about a subject. Mrs. Nipson gives out the subjects. Today the subject was les oiseaux, and Rose Red said, "J'aime beaucoup les oiseaux, et surtout ceux qui sont rôtis," which made us all laugh. That ridiculous little Bella Arkwright said, "J'aime beaucoup les oiseaux qui sing." She thought sing was French. Every girl in school began, "J'aime beaucoup les oiseaux." Tomorrow the subject is Jules César. I'm sure I don't know what to say. There isn't a word in Ollendorf about him. There aren't so many new scholars this term as there were last. The girls think it is because Mrs. Nipson isn't so popular as Mrs. Florence used to be. 2 or 3 of the new ones look pleasant, but I don't know them yet. Louisa Agnew is the nicest girl here next to Rose. Lily Page says she is vulgar because her father paints portraits and they don't know the same people that Cousin Olivia knows, but she isn't a bit. We went to spend the day there just before we left Ashburn, and her father and mother were splendid. Their house is just full of all sorts of queer, interesting things and pictures, and Mr. Agnew told us ever so many stories about painters and what they did. One was about a boy who used to make figures of lions in butter, and afterward he became famous. I forget his name. We had a lovely time. I wish you could see Lou's little sister Daisy. She's only 2 and a perfect little beauty. She has got 10 teeth and hardly ever cries. Please ask papa—" Just as Clover had got to this point she was interrupted by Katy, who walked in with her hat on and a whole handful of letters. "See here," she cried. "Isn't this delightful? Miss Marsh took me with her to the post office and we found these. 3 for you and 2 for me and 1 for Rose. Wait a minute till I give Rose hers, and we'll read them together." In another moment the two were cosily seated with their heads close together, opening their budget. First came one from papa. "My dearest daughters," "It's for you too, you see," said Katy. "Last week came your letter of the 31st, and we were glad to hear that you were well and ready to go back to school. By the time this reaches you, you will be in Hillsover, and your winter term begun. Make the most of it, for we all feel as if we could never let you go from home again. Johnny says she shall rub Spaulding's prepared glue all over your dresses when you come back, so that you cannot stir. I am a little of the same way of thinking myself. Cecy has returned from boarding school, and set up as a young lady. Elsie is much excited over the party dresses which Mrs. Hall is having made for her, and goes over every day to see if anything new has come. I am glad on this account that you were away just now, for it would not be easy to keep steady heads and continue your studies with so much going on next door. I have sent Cousin Olivia a check to pay for the things she bought for you, and am much obliged to her for seeing that you were properly fitted out. Katy was very right to consider expense, but I wish you to have all things needful. I enclose 2 $10 bills, 1 for each of you, for pocket money, and with much love from the children am, yours affectionately, P. Carr. P.S. Cousin Helen has had a sharp attack, but is better. "I wish papa would write longer letters," said Katy. "He always sends us money, but he don't send half enough words with it." She folded the letter and fondled it affectionately. "He's always so busy," replied Clover. "Don't you remember how he used to sit down at his desk and scribble off his letters, and how somebody was always sure to ring the bell before he got through? I'm very glad to have some money, for now I can pay the 62 cents I owe you. It's my turn to read. This is from Elsie, and a real long one. Put away the bills first, Katy, or they'll be lost. That's right. Now we'll begin together. Dear Clover, you don't know how glad I am when my turn comes to get a letter all to myself. Of course I read papa's and all the rest you write to the family, but it never seems as if you were talking to me unless you begin, 'Dear Elsie.' I wish sometime you'd put in a little note marked 'Private' just for me, which nobody else need see. It would be such fun. Please do. I should think you would have hated staying at Cousin Olivia's. When I read what she said about your traveling dresses looking as if they had come out of the ark, I was too mad for anything. But I shouldn't think you'd want much to go back to school either, though sometimes it must be splendid. John has named her old stockinette doll, which she used to call Scratch Face, Nippy, after Mrs. Nipson, and I made her a muslin cap, and Dorry drew a pair of black spectacles round her eyes. She's a perfect fright, and John plays all the time that dreadful things happen to her. She pricks her with pins and pretends she has the earache, and lets her tumble down and hurt herself, till sometimes I nearly feel sorry, though it is all make-believe. When you wrote us about only having pudding for dinner, I didn't a bit. John put her into the rag closet that very day and has been starving her to death ever since, and Phil says it serves her right. You can't think how awfully lonely I sometimes get without you. If it wasn't for Helen Gibbs, that new girl I told you about, I shouldn't know what to do. She's the prettiest girl in Miss McCrane's school. Her hair curls just like mine, only it is 4 times as long and 1,000,000 times as thick, and her waist is really and truly not much bigger around than a bedpost. We're the greatest friends. She says she loves me just exactly as much as if I was her sister, but she never had any real sisters. She was quite mad the other day because I said I couldn't love her quite so well as you and Katy, and all recess time she wouldn't speak to me, but now we've made up. Dorry is so awfully in love with her that I can never get him to come into the room when she is here, and he blushes when we tease him about her. But this is a great secret. Dorry and I play chess every evening. He almost always beats, unless papa comes behind and helps me. Phil has learned too, because he always wants to do everything that we do. Dorry gives him a castle and a bishop and a knight and 4 pawns and then beats him in 6 moves. Phil gets so mad that we can't help laughing. Last night he buttoned his king up inside his jacket and said, "There, you can't checkmate me now anyway." Cecy has come home. She is a young lady now. She does her hair up quite different and wears long dresses. This winter she is going to parties, and Mrs. Hall is going to have a party for her on Thursday, with real grown-up young ladies and gentlemen at it. Cecy has got some beautiful new dresses, a white muslin, a blue tarlatan, and a pink silk. The pink silk is the prettiest, I think. Cecy is real kind and lets me see all her things. She has got a lovely breastpin too, and a new fan with ivory sticks, and all sorts of things. I wish I was grown up. It must be so nice. I was to tell you something, only you mustn't tell anybody except Katy. Don't you remember how Cecy used to say that she never was going out to drive with young gentlemen, but was going to stay at home and read the Bible to poor people? Well, she didn't tell the truth, for she has been out 3 times already with Sylvester Slack in his buggy. When I told her she oughtn't to do so because it was breaking a promise, she only laughed and said I was a silly little girl. Isn't it queer? I want to tell you what an awful thing I did the other night. Maria Avery invited me to tea, and Papa said I might go. I didn't want to much, but I didn't know what to tell Maria, so I went. You know how poor they are, and how Aunt Izzie used to say that they were touchy, so I thought I would take great care not to hurry home right after tea for fear they would think I wasn't having a good time. So I waited and waited and waited and got so sleepy that I had to pinch my fingers to keep awake. At last I was sure that it must be almost 9, so I asked Mr. Avery if he'd please take me home, and don't you believe when we got there it was 10:15 and Papa was coming for me. Dorry said he guessed I must be enjoying myself to stay so late. I didn't tell anybody about it for 3 days because I knew they'd laugh at me, and they did. Wasn't it funny? And old Mrs. Avery looked as sleepy as I felt and kept yawning behind her hand. I told Papa if I had a watch of my own I shouldn't make such mistakes, and he laughed and said, "We'll see." Oh, do you suppose that means he's going to give me one? We are so proud of Dorry's having taken 2 prizes at the examination yesterday. He took the 2nd Latin prize and the 1st mathematics. Dr. Pullman says he thinks Dorry is one of the most thorough boys he ever saw. Isn't that nice? The prizes were books. One was the life of Benjamin Franklin, and the other the life of General Butler. Papa says he doesn't think much of the life of Butler, but Dorry has begun it, and says it is splendid. Phil says when he takes a prize he wants candy and a new knife, but he'll have to wait a good while unless he studies harder than he does now. He's just come in to tease me to go up into the garret and help him get down his sled, because he thinks it is going to snow. But there isn't a sign of it, and the weather is quite warm. I asked him what I should say for him to you, and he said, "Oh, tell her to come home and anything you please." I said, "Shall I give her your love and say that you are very well?" And he says, "Oh, yes, Miss Elsie, I guess you'd think yourself mighty well if your head ached as much as mine does every day." Don't be frightened, however, for he's just as fat and rosy as can be. But almost every day he says he feels sick about school time. When Papa was at Moorfield, Miss Finch believed him and let him stay home 2 mornings. I don't wonder at it, for you can think what a face he makes up. But he got well so fast that she pays no attention to him now. The other day, about 11 o'clock, Papa met him coming along the road, shying stones at the birds and making lots of noise. He told Papa he felt so sick that his teacher had let him go home, but Papa noticed that his mouth looked sticky, so he opened his dinner basket and found that the little scamp had eaten up all his dinner on the road, corned beef, bread and butter, a great piece of mince pie, and 6 pears. Papa couldn't help laughing, but he made him turn around and go right back to school again. I told you in my last about Johnny's going to school with me now. She's very proud of it, and is always talking about Elsie's and my school. She's twice as smart as the other girls of her age. Miss McCrane has put her into the composition class, where they write compositions on their slates. The first subject was a kitten, and John's began, "She's a dear, little, soft, scratching thing, only you'd better not pull her by the tail, but she's real cunning." All the girls laughed, and Johnny called out, "Well, it's true, anyhow." I can't write any more, for I must study my Latin. Besides, this is the longest letter that ever was. I have been 4 days writing it. Please send me one just as long. Old Mary and the children send lots of love, and Papa says, "Tell Katy if a pudding diet sets her to growing again, she must come home at once, for he couldn't afford it." Oh dear, how I wish I could see you. Please give my love to Rose Red. She must be perfectly splendid. Your affectionate Elsie. Oh, the dear little duck. Isn't that just like her? Said Clover. I think Elsie has a real genius for writing, don't you? She tells all the little things, and is so droll and cunning. Nobody writes such nice letters. Who's that from, Katy? Cousin Helen, and it's been such a long time coming. Just look at this date, September 22nd, a whole month ago. Then she began to read. Dear Katy, it seems a long time since we have had a talk, but I have been less well lately, so that it has been difficult to write. Yesterday I sat up for the first time in several weeks, and today I am dressed and beginning to feel like myself. I wish you could see my room this morning. I often wish this, but it is so particularly pretty, for little Helen has been in with a great basket full of leaves and flowers, and together we have dressed it to perfection. There are 4 vases of roses, a bowl full of chrysanthemums, and red leaves around all my pictures. The leaves are Virginia creeper. It doesn't last long, but it is lovely while it lasts. Helen also brought a bird's nest which the gardener found in a hawthorn tree on the lawn. It hangs on a branch, and she has tied it to one side of my bookshelves. On the opposite side is another nest quite different, a great gray hornet's nest, as big as a bandbox, which came from the mountains a year ago. I wonder if any such grow in the woods about Hillsover. In spite of the red leaves, the day is warm as summer, and the windows stand wide open. I suppose it is cooler with you, but I know it is delicious cold. Now that I think of it, you must be in Ashburn by this time. I hope you will enjoy every moment of your vacation. October 19th. I did not finish my letter the day it was begun, dear Katy, and the next morning it proved that I was not so strong as I fancied, and I had to go to bed again. I am still there, and, as you see, writing with a pencil. But do not be worried about me, for the doctor says I am mending, and soon I hope to be up and in my chair. The red leaves are gone, but the roses are lovely as ever, for little Helen keeps bringing me fresh ones. She has just been in to read me her composition. The subject was stars, and you can't think how much she found to say about them. She is a bright little creature, and it is a great pleasure to teach her. I am hardly ever so sick that she cannot come for her lessons, and she gets on fast. We have made an arrangement that when she knows more than I do, she is to give me lessons, and I am not sure that the time is so very far off. I must tell you about my Ben. He is a new canary which was given me in the summer, and lately he has grown so delightfully tame that I feel as if it were not a bird at all, but a fairy prince come to live with me and amuse me. The cage door is left open always now, and he flies in and out as he likes. He is a restless, inquisitive fellow, and visits any part of the room, trying each fresh thing with his bill to see if it is good to eat, and then perching on it to see if it is good to sit upon. He mistakes his own reflection in the looking-glass for another canary, and sits on the pincushion twittering and making love to himself for half an hour at a time. To watch him is one of my greatest amusements, especially just now when I am in bed so much. Sometimes he hides and keeps so still that I have not the least idea where he is, but the moment I call "Ben, Ben," and hold out my finger, wings begin to rustle, and out he flies and perches on my finger. He isn't the least bit in the world afraid, but sits on my head or shoulder, eats out of my mouth, and kisses me with his beak. He is on the pillow at this moment, making runs at my pencil, of which he is mortally jealous. It is just so with my combs and brushes if I attempt to do my hair. He cannot bear to have me do anything but play with him. I do wish I could show him to you and Clover. Little Helen, my other pet, has just come in with a sponge cake which she frosted herself. She sends her love, and says when you come to me next summer she will frost you each one just like it. Goodbye, my Katy. I had nothing to write about, and have written it, but I never like to keep silent too long, or let you feel as if you were forgotten by your loving cousin, Helen. P.S. Be sure to wear plenty of warm wraps for your winter walks, and Katy dear, you must eat meat every day. Mrs. Nipson will probably give up her favorite pudding now that the cold weather has begun, but if not, write to Papa. "Isn't that letter Cousin Helen all over?" said Katy. "So little about her illness, and so bright and merry, and yet she has really been sick. Papa says a sharp attack. Isn't she the dearest person in the world, next to Papa, I mean? Yes, indeed. There's nobody like her. I do hope we can go to see her next summer. Now it's my turn. I can't think who this letter is from. Oh, Clarence! Katy, I can't let you see this. I promised I wouldn't show his letters to anybody, not even you." "Oh, very well. But you've got another. Dory, isn't it? Read that first, and I'll go away and leave you in peace." So Clover read, "Dear Clover, Elsie says she is going to write you today, but I won't stop because next Saturday I'm going out fishing with the Slacks. There are a great many trout now in Blue Brook. Eugene caught 6 the other day. No, 5. One was a minnow. Papa has given me a splendid rod. It lets out as tall as a house. I hope I shall catch with it. Alexander says the trout will admire it so much that they can't help biting, but he was only funning. Elsie and I play chess most every night. She plays a real good game for a girl. Sometimes Pa helps, and then she beats. Miss Finch is well. She don't keep house quite like Katy did, and I don't like her so well as I do you, but she's pretty nice. The other day we had a nutting picnic, and she gave me and Phil a loaf of election cake and 6 quince turnovers to carry. The boys gave 3 cheers for her when they saw them. Did Elsie tell you that I have invented a new machine? It is called the Intellectual Peach Parer. There is a place to hold a book while you pare the peaches. It is very convenient. I don't think of anything else to tell you. Cecy has got home and is going to have a party next week. She's grown up now, she says, and she wears her hair quite different. It's a great deal thicker than it used to be. Elsie says it's because there are rats in it, but I don't believe her. Elsie has got a new friend. Her name is Helen Gibbs. She's quite pretty. Your affectionate brother, Dory. P.S. John wants to put in a note. John's note was written in a round hand, as easy to read as print. Dear Clover, I am well and hope you are the same. I wish you would write me a letter of my own. I go to school with Elsie now. We write compositions. They are hard to write. We don't go up into the loft half so much as we used to when you were at home. Mrs. Worrett came to dinner last week. She says she weighs 280 pounds. I should think it would be dreadful to weigh that. I only weigh 76. My head comes up to the mark on the door where you were measured when you were 12. Isn't that tall? Good-bye. I send a kiss to Katy. Your loving, John. After they had finished this note, Katy went away, leaving Clover to open Clarence's letter by herself. It was not so well written or spelt as Dorry's by any means. Dear Clover, don't forget what you promised. I mean about not showing this. And don't tell Lily I wrote. If you do, she'll be as mad as hops. I haven't been doing much since you went away. School begun yesterday, and I am glad, for it's awfully dull now that you girls have gone. Mother says Guest has got fleas on him, so she won't let him come into the house any more. I stay out in the barn with him instead. He is well, and sends you a wag of his tail. Jim and me are making him a collar. It is black with G.P. on it, for Guest Paige, you know. A lot of the boys had a camping out last week. I went. It was real jolly, but Ma wouldn't let me stay all night, so I lost the best part. They roasted sculpins for supper and had a bonfire. The camp was on Hartsnet Hill. Next time you come I'll take you out there. Pa has gone to Maine on business. He said I must take care of the house, so I've borrowed Jim's gun, and if any robbers come I mean to shoot them. I always go to sleep with a broom against the door so as to wake up when they open it. This morning I thought they had come, for the broom was gone, and the gun too, but it was only Bridget. She opened the door and it fell down, but I didn't wake up, so she took it away and put the gun in the closet. I was mad, I can tell you. This is only a short letter, but I hope you will answer it soon. Give my love to Katy, and tell Dorry that if he likes I'll send him my compass for his machinery, because I've got two. Your affectionate cousin, Clarence Paige. This was the last of the budget. As Clover folded it up, she was dismayed by the tinkle of the tea bell. "Oh, dear," she cried, "there's tea, and I've not finished my letter to Elsie. Where has the afternoon gone? How splendid it has been! I wish I could have 4 letters every day as long as I live." End of chapter 10. What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. What Katy Did at School, by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 11. Christmas Boxes. October was a delightful month, clear and sparkling, but early in November the weather changed and became very cold. Thick frosts fell, every leaf vanished from the woods, in the gardens only blackened stalks remained to show where once the summer flowers had been. In spite of the stove outside the door, number 2 began to be chilly. More than once Katy found her toothbrush stiff with ice in the morning. It was a foretaste of what the winter was to be, and the girls shivered at the prospect. Toward the end of November Miss Jane caught a heavy cold. Unsparing of herself as of others, she went on hearing her classes as usual, and nobody paid much attention to her hoarseness and flushed cheeks until she grew so much worse that she was forced to go to bed. There she stayed for nearly 4 weeks. It made a great change in the school, and the girls found it such a relief to have her sharp voice and eyes taken away that I am afraid they were rather glad of her illness than otherwise. Katy shared in this feeling of relief. She did not like Miss Jane. It was pleasant not to have to see or hear of her. But as day after day passed, and still she continued ill, Katy's conscience began to prick. One night she lay awake a long time and heard Miss Jane coughing violently. Katy feared she was very sick, and wondered who took care of her all night and all day. None of the girls went near her. The servants were always busy, and Mrs. Nipson, who did not love Miss Jane, was busy too. In the morning, while studying and practicing, Katy caught herself thinking over this question. At last she asked Miss Marsh, "How is Miss Jane today?" "About the same. She is not dangerously ill, the doctor says, but she coughs a great deal and has some fever." "Is anybody sitting with her?" "Oh, no, there's no need of anyone. Susan answers the bell, and she has her medicine on the table within reach." It sounded forlorn enough. Katy had lived in a sick room so long herself that she knew just how dreary it is for an invalid to be left alone with medicine within reach and someone to answer a bell. She began to feel sorry for Miss Jane, and almost without intending it, went down the entry and tapped at her door. The "Come in" sounded very faint, and Miss Jane, as she lay in bed, looked weak and dismal, and quite unlike the sharp, terrible person whom the girls feared so much. She was amazed at the sight of Katy, and made a feeble attempt to hold up her head and speak as usual. "What is it, Miss Carr?" "I only came to see how you are," said Katy, abashed at her own daring. "You coughed so much last night that I was afraid you were worse. Isn't there something I could do for you?" "Thank you," said Miss Jane. "You are very kind." Think of Miss Jane's thanking anybody and calling anybody kind. "I should be very glad. Isn't there anything?" repeated Katy, encouraged. "Well, I don't know. You might put another stick of wood on the fire," said Miss Jane in an ungracious tone. Katy did so, and seeing that the iron cup on top of the stove was empty, she poured some water into it. Then she took a look about the room. Books and papers were scattered over the table. Clean clothes from the wash lay on the chairs. Nothing was in its place, and Katy, who knew how particular Miss Jane was on the subject of order, guessed at the discomfort which this untidy state of affairs must have caused her. "Wouldn't you like to have me put these away?" she asked, touching the pile of clothes. Miss Jane sighed impatiently, but she did not say no, so Katy, taking silence for consent, opened the drawers and laid the clothes inside, guessing at the right places with a sort of instinct, and making as little noise and bustle as possible. Next she moved quietly to the table, where she sorted and arranged the papers, piled up the books, and put the pens and pencils in a small tray which stood there for the purpose. Lastly she began to dust the table with her pocket-handkerchief, which proceeding roused Miss Jane at once. "Don't," she said. "There's a duster in the cupboard." Katy could not help smiling, but she found the duster and proceeded to put the rest of the room into nice order, laying a fresh towel over the bedside table, and arranging watch, medicine, and spoon within reach. Miss Jane lay and watched her. I think she was as much surprised at herself for permitting all this as Katy was at being permitted to do it. Sick people often consent because they feel too weak to object. After all, it was comfortable to have someone come in and straighten the things which for 10 days past had vexed her neat eyes with their untidiness. Lastly, smoothing the quilt, Katy asked if Miss Jane wouldn't like to have her pillow shaken up. "I don't care," was the answer. It sounded discouraging, but Katy boldly seized the pillow, beat, smoothed, and put it again in place. Then she went out of the room as noiselessly as she could, Miss Jane never saying thank you, or seeming to observe whether she went or stayed. Rose Red and Clover could hardly believe their ears when told where she had been. They stared at her as people stare at Van Omberg when he comes safely out of the lion's den. "My stars!" exclaimed Rose, drawing a long breath. "You didn't really? And she hasn't bitten your head off?" "Not a bit," said Katy, laughing. "What's more, I'm going again." She was as good as her word. After that she went to see Miss Jane very often. Almost always there was some little thing which she could do. The fire needed mending, or the pitcher to be filled with ice water, or Miss Jane wanted the blinds opened or shut. Gradually she grew used to seeing Katy about the room. One morning she actually allowed her to brush her hair, and Katy's touch was so light and pleasant that afterwards Miss Jane begged her to do it every day. "What makes you such a good nurse?" she asked one afternoon, rather abruptly. "Being sick myself," replied Katy gently. Then, in answer to farther questioning, she told of her 4 years' illness, and her life upstairs, keeping house and studying lessons all alone by herself. Miss Jane did not say anything when she got through, but Katy fancied she looked at her in a new and kinder way. So time went on till Christmas. It fell on a Friday that year, which shortened the holidays by a day and disappointed many of the girls. Only a few went home, the rest were left to pass the time as best they might till Monday, when lessons were to begin again. "It isn't much like Merry Christmas," sighed Clover to herself as she looked up at the uncottoned space at the top of the window and saw great snowflakes wildly whirling by. Number 2 felt cold and dreary, and she was glad to exchange it for the schoolroom, round whose warm stove a cluster of girls was huddling. Everybody was in bad spirits. There was a tendency to talk about home, and the nice time which people were having there, and the very bad time they themselves were having at the nunnery. "Isn't it miserable? I shall cry all night. I know I shall. I'm so homesick," gulped Lily, who had taken possession of her roommate's shoulder and was weeping ostentatiously. "I declare, you're just Mrs. Gummidge and David Copperfield over again," said Rose. "You recollect her, girls, don't you? When the porridge was burnt, you know. All of us felt the disappointment, but Mrs. Gummidge felt it the most. Isn't Lily a real Mrs. Gummidge, girls?" The observation changed Lily's tears into anger. "You're as hateful and as horrid as you can be, Rose Red," she exclaimed angrily. Then she flew out of the room and shut the door behind her with a bang. "There, she's gone upstairs to be mad," said Louisa Agnew. "I don't care if she has," replied Rose, who was in a perverse mood. "I wish you hadn't said that, Rosie," whispered Clover. "Lily really felt badly." "Well, what if she did? So do I feel badly, and you, and the rest of us. Lily hasn't taken out a patent for bad feelings, which nobody must infringe. What business has she to make us feel badder by setting up to be so much worse than the rest of the world?" Clover said nothing, but went on with a book she was reading. In less than 10 minutes Rose, whose sun seldom stayed long behind a cloud, was at her elbow, dimpling and coaxing. "I forgive you," she whispered, giving Clover's arm a little pinch. "What for?" "For being in the right. About Lily, I mean. I was rather hateful to her, I confess. Never mind, when she comes downstairs I'll make up. She's a crocodile if there ever was one, but as she's your cousin I'll be good to her. Kiss me quick to prove that you're not vexed." "Vexed indeed," said Clover, kissing the middle of the pink cheek. "I wonder if anybody ever stayed vexed with you for 10 minutes together, you rosy-posy you." "Bless you, yes. Miss Jane, for example. She hates me like poison, and all the time. Well, what of it? I know she's sick, but I can't tell a lie, Pa, on that account. Where's Katy?" "Gone in to see her, I believe." "One of these days," prophesied Rose solemnly, "she'll go into that room and she'll never come out again. Miss Jane is getting back into biting condition. I advise Katy to be careful." "What's that noise? Sleigh bells, I declare! Girls!" mounting a desk and peeping out of the window. "Somebody's got a big box! A big one! Here's old Joyce at the door with his sledge. Now who do you suppose it is?" "It's for me, I'm sure it's for me," cried half a dozen voices. "Bella, my love, peep over the balusters and see if you can't see the name," cried Louisa, and Bella, nothing loath, departed at once on this congenial errand. "No, I can't," she reported, coming back from the hall. "The name's tipped up against the wall. There's 2 boxes. One is big and one is little." "Oh, who can they be for?" clamored the girls. Half the school expected boxes, and had been watching the storm all day, with a dreadful fear that it would block the roads and delay the expected treasures. At this moment Mrs. Nipson came in. "There will be the usual study hour this evening," she announced. "All of you will prepare lessons for Monday morning. Miss Carr, come here for a moment, if you please." Clover, wondering, followed her into the entry. "A parcel has arrived for you, and a box," said Mrs. Nipson. "I presume that they contain articles for Christmas. I will have the nails removed, and both of them placed in your room this evening, but I expect you to refrain from examining them until tomorrow. The vacation does not open until after study hour tonight, and it will then be too late for you to begin." "Very well, ma'am," said Clover demurely, but the minute Mrs. Nipson's back was turned she gave a jump and rushed into the schoolroom. "Oh, girls," she cried, "what do you think? Both the boxes are for Katy and me." "Both?" cried a disappointed chorus. "Yes, both. Nipson said so. I'm sorry for you, but isn't it nice for us? We've never had a box from home before, you know, and I didn't think we should, it's so far off. Oh, it's too lovely. But I do hope yours will come tonight." Clover's voice was so sympathizing, for all its glee, that nobody could help being glad with her. "You little darling," said Louisa, giving her a hug. "I'm rejoiced that the box is yours. The rest of us are always getting them, and you and Katy never had a thing before. I hope it's a nice one." Study hour seemed unusually long that night. The minute it was over the sisters ran to number 2. There stood the boxes, a big wooden one with all the nails taken out of the lid, and a small paper one, carefully tied up and sealed. It was almost more than the girls could do to obey orders and not peep. "I feel something hard," announced Clover, inserting a finger top under the lid. "Oh, do you?" cried Katy. Then, making a heroic effort, she dumped into the bed. "It's the only way," she said. "You'd better come too, Clovy. Blow the candle out and let's get to sleep as fast as we can, so as to make morning come quicker." Katy dreamed of home that night. Perhaps it was that which made her wake so early. It was not 5 o'clock, and the room was perfectly dark. She did not like to disturb Clover, so she lay perfectly still for hours, as it seemed, till a faint gray dawn crept in and revealed the outlines of the big box standing by the window. Then she could wait no longer, but crept out of bed, crossed the floor on tiptoe, and raising the lid a little, put in her hand. Something crumbly and sugary met it, and when she drew it out, there, fitting on her finger like a ring, was a round cake with a hole in the middle of it. "Oh, it's one of Debbie's jumbles!" she exclaimed. "Where? What are you doing? Give me one, too," cried Clover, starting up. Katy rummaged till she found another, then, half frozen, she ran back to bed, and the two lay nibbling the jumbles and talking about home till dawn deepened into daylight and morning was fairly come. Breakfast was half an hour later than usual, which was comfortable. As soon as it was over, the girls proceeded to unpack their box. The day was so cold that they wrapped themselves in shawls, and Clover put on a hood and thick gloves. Rose Red, passing the door, burst out laughing, and recommended that she should add india rubbers and an umbrella. "Come in," cried the sisters. "Come in and help us open our box." "Oh, by the way, you have a box, haven't you?" said Rose, who was perfectly aware of the important fact, and had presented herself with the hope of being asked to look on. "Thank you, but perhaps I would better come some other time. I shall be in your way." "You humbug!" said Clover, while Katy seized Rose and pulled her into the room. "There, sit on the bed, you ridiculous goose, and put on my gray cloak. How can you be so absurd as to say you won't? You know we want you, and you know you came on purpose." "Did I?" "Well, perhaps I did," laughed Rose. Then Katy lifted off the lid and set it against the door. It was an exciting moment. "Just look here," cried Katy. The top of the box was mostly taken up with 4 square paper boxes, round which parcels of all shapes and sizes were wedged and fitted. The whole was a miracle of packing. It had taken Miss Finch 3 mornings, with assistance from old Mary, and much advice from Elsie, to do it so beautifully. Each box held a different kind of cake. One was of jumbles, another of ginger snaps, a third of crullers, and the fourth contained a big square loaf of frosted plum cake, with a circle of sugar almonds set in the frosting. How the trio exclaimed at this! "I never imagined anything so nice," declared Rose, with her mouth full of jumble. "As for those snaps, they're simply perfect. What can be in all those fascinating bundles? Do hurry and open one, Katy." Dear little Elsie! The first 2 bundles opened were hers, a white hood for Katy and a blue one for Clover, both of her own knitting and so nicely done. The girls were enchanted. "How she has improved," said Katy. "She knits better than either of us, Clover." "There never was such a clever little darling," responded Clover, and they patted the hoods, tried them on before the glass, and spent so much time in admiring them that Rose grew impatient. "I declare," she cried, "it isn't any of my funeral, I know, but if you don't open another parcel soon I shall certainly fall to myself. It seems as if, what with cold and curiosity, I couldn't wait." "Very well," said Katy, laying aside her hood, with one final glance. "Take out a bundle, Clover. It's your turn." Clover's bundle was for herself, Evangeline in blue and gold, and pretty soon Golden Legend in the same binding appeared for Katy. Both these were from Dorry. Next came a couple of round packages of exactly the same size. These proved to be inkstands covered with Russian leather, one marked Katy from Johnny and the other Clover from Phil. It was evident that the children had done their shopping together, for presently 2 long narrow parcels revealed the carved pen handles precisely alike, and these were labeled Katy from Phil and Clover from Johnny. What fun it was opening those bundles! The girls made a long business of it, taking out but one at a time, exclaiming, admiring, and exhibiting to Rose, before they began upon another. They laughed, they joked, but I do not think it would have taken much to make either of them cry. It was almost too tender a pleasure, these proofs of loving remembrance from the little ones, and each separate article seemed full of the very look and feel of home. "What can this be?" said Katy, as she unrolled a paper and disclosed a pretty round box. She opened. Nothing was visible but pink cotton wool. Katy peeped beneath and gave a cry. "Oh, Clovy, such a lovely thing! It's from papa. Of course it's from papa. How could he? It's a great deal too pretty." The lovely thing was a long, slender chain for Katy's watch, worked in fine yellow gold. Clover admired it extremely, and her joy knew no bounds when further search revealed another box with a precisely similar chain for herself. It was too much. The girls fairly cried with pleasure. "There never was such a papa in the world," they said. "Yes, there is. Mine is just as good," declared Rose, twinkling away a little teardrop from her own eyes. "Now don't cry, honeys. Your papa's an angel, there's no doubt about it. I never saw such pretty chains in my life, never. As for the children, they're little ducks. You certainly are a wonderful family. Katy, I'm dying to know what is in the blue parcel." The blue parcel was from Cecy, and contained a pretty blue ribbon for Clover. There was a pink one also, with a pink ribbon for Katy. Everybody had thought of the girls. Old Mary had sent them each a yard measure, Miss Finch a thread case stocked with differently colored cottons. Alexander had cracked a bag full of hickory nuts. "Did you ever?" said Rose, when this last was produced. "What a thing it is to be popular." "Mrs. Hall? Who's Mrs. Hall?" asked Clover, unwrapped a tiny carved easel. "She's Cecy's mother," explained Clover. "Wasn't she kind to send me this, Katy? And here's Cecy's photograph in a little frame for you." Never was such a wonderful box. It appeared to have no bottom whatever. Under the presents were parcels of figs, prunes, almonds, raisins, candy; under those, apples and pears. There seemed no end to the surprises. At last all were out. "Now," said Katy, "let's throw back the apples and pears, and then I want you to help divide the other things and make some packages for the girls. They were all disappointed not to have their boxes. I should like to have them share ours. Wouldn't you, Clover?" "Yes, indeed. I was just going to propose it." So Clover cut 29 squares of white paper, Rose and Katy sorted and divided, and pretty soon gingersnaps and almonds and sugarplums were walking down all the entries, and a gladsome crunching showed that the girls had found pleasant enjoyment. None of the snowed-up boxes got through till Monday, so except for Katy and Clover the school would have had no Christmas treat at all. They carried Mrs. Nipson a large slice of cake and a basket full of the beautiful red apples. All the teachers were remembered, and the servants. The S.S.U.C. was convened and feasted, and as for Rose, Louisa, and other special cronies, dainties were heaped upon them with such unsparing hand that they finally remonstrated. "You're giving everything away. You'll have nothing left for yourselves." "Yes, we shall. Plenty," said Clover. "Oh, Rosie, here's such a splendid pear. You must have this." "No, no," protested Rose, but Clover forced it into her pocket. The Carr's box was always quoted in the nunnery afterward as an example of what papas and mammas could accomplish when they were of the right sort and really wanted to make schoolgirls happy. Distributing their treasures kept Katy and Clover so busy that it was not until after dinner that they found time to open the smaller box. When they did so, they were sorry for the delay. The box was full of flowers, roses, geranium leaves, heliotrope, beautiful red and white carnations, all so bedded in cotton that the frost had not touched them. But they looked chilled, and Katy hastened to put them in warm water, which she had been told was the best way to revive drooping flowers. Cousin Helen had sent them, and underneath, sewed to the box that they might not shake about and do mischief, were 2 flat parcels wrapped in tissue paper and tied with white ribbon in Cousin Helen's dainty way. They were glove cases of quilted silk, delicately scented, one white and one lilac, and to each was pinned a loving note, wishing the girls a Merry Christmas. "How awfully good people are," said Clover. "I do think we ought to be the best girls in the world." Last of all, Katy made a choice little selection from her stores, a splendid apple, a couple of fine pears, and a handful of raisins and figs, and with a few of the freshest flowers in a wineglass, she went down the row and tapped at Miss Jane's door. Miss Jane was sitting up for the first time, wrapped in a shawl, and looking very thin and pale. Katy, who had almost ceased to be afraid of her, went in cheerily. "We've had a delicious box from home, Miss Jane, full of all sorts of things. It has been such fun unpacking it. I've brought you an apple, some pears, and this little bunch of flowers. Wasn't it a nice Christmas for us?" "Yes," said Miss Jane, "very nice indeed. I heard some one say in the entry that you had a box." "Thank you," as Katy set the basket and glass on the table. "Those flowers are very sweet. I wish you a Merry Christmas, I'm sure." This was much from Miss Jane, who couldn't help speaking shortly, even when she was pleased. Katy withdrew in high glee. But that night, just before bedtime, something happened so surprising that Katy, telling Clover of it afterward, said she half fancied that she must have dreamed it all. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening. She was passing down Quaker Row, and Miss Jane called and asked her to come in. Miss Jane's cheeks were flushed, and she spoke fast, as if she had resolved to say something and thought the sooner it was over the better. "Miss Carr," she began, "I wish to tell you that I made up my mind some time since that we did you an injustice last term. It is not your attentions to me during my illness which have changed my opinion. That was done before I fell ill. It is your general conduct and the good influence which I have seen you exert over other girls which convince me that we must have been wrong about you. That is all. I thought you might like to hear me say this, and I shall say the same to Mrs. Nipson." "Thank you," said Katy. "You don't know how glad I am." She half thought she would kiss Miss Jane, but somehow it didn't seem possible, so she shook hands very heartily instead, and flew to her room, feeling as if her feet were wings. "It seems too good to be true. I want to cry, I'm so happy," she told Clover. "What a lovely day this has been." And of all she had received, I think Katy considered this explanation with Miss Jane as her very best Christmas box. End of chapter 11. 12 of What Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, June 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 12. Waiting for Spring. School was a much happier place after this. Mrs. Nipson never alluded to the matter, but her manner altered. Katy felt that she was no longer watched or distrusted, and her heart grew light. In another week Miss Jane was so much better as to be hearing her classes again. Illness had not changed her materially. It is only in novels that rheumatic fever sweetens tempers and makes disagreeable people over into agreeable ones. Most of the girls disliked her as much as ever. Her tongue was just as sharp and her manner as grim. But for Katy, from that time forward, there was a difference. Miss Jane was not affectionate to her, it was not in her nature to be that, but she was civil and considerate, and in a dry way friendly, and gradually Katy grew to have an odd sort of liking for her. Do any of you know how incredibly long winter seems in climates where for weeks together the thermometer stands at 0? There is something hopeless in such cold. You think of summer as of a thing read about somewhere in a book, but which has no actual existence. Winter seems the only reality in the world. Katy and Clover felt this hopelessness growing upon them as the days went on, and the weather became more and more severe. 10, 20, even 30 degrees below 0 was no unusual register for the Hillsover thermometers. Such cold half frightened them, but nobody else was frightened or surprised. It was dry, brilliant cold. The December snows lay unmelted on the ground in March, and the paths cut then were crisp and hard still, only the white walls on either side had risen higher and higher, till only a moving line of hoods and tippets was visible above them when the school went out for its daily walk. Morning after morning the girls woke to find thick crusts of frost on their window panes, and every drop of water in the washbowl or pitcher turned to solid ice. Night after night Clover, who was a chilly little creature, lay shivering and unable to sleep, notwithstanding the hot bricks at her feet and the many wraps which Katy piled upon her. To Katy herself the cold was more bracing than depressing. There was something in her blood which responded to the sharp tingle of frost, and she gained in strength in a remarkable way during this winter. But the long storms told upon her spirits. She pined for spring and home more than she liked to tell, and felt the need of variety in their monotonous life, where the creeping days appeared like weeks, and the weeks stretched themselves out and seemed as long as months do in other places. The girls resorted to all sorts of devices to keep themselves alive during this dreary season. They had little epidemics of occupation. At one time it was spattering, when all faces and fingers had a tendency to smudges of India ink, and there was hardly a fine comb or toothbrush fit for use in the establishment. Then a rage for tatting set in, followed by a fever of fancy work, everyone falling in love with the same pattern at the same time, and copying and recopying, till nobody could bear the sight of it. At one time Clover counted 18 girls all at work on the same bead and canvas pincushion. Later there was a short period of decalcomanie, and then came the grand album craze, when 33 girls out of the 39 sent for blank books bound in red morocco and began to collect signatures and sentiments. Here also there was a tendency toward repetition. Sally Austin added to her autograph these lines of her own composition: "When on this page your beauteous eyes you bend, let it remind you of your absent friend, Sally J. Austin, Galveston, Texas." The girls found this sentiment charming, at least a dozen borrowed it, and in half the albums in the school you might read, "When on this page your beauteous eyes," etc. Esther Dearborn wrote in Clover's book, "The better part of valor is discretion." Why she wrote it nobody knew, or why it was more applicable to Clover than to anyone else, but the sentiment proved popular and was repeated over and over again, above various neatly written signatures. There was a strife as to who should display the largest collection. Some of the girls sent home for autographs of distinguished persons, which they pasted in their books. Rose Red, however, outdid them all. "Did I ever show you mine?" she asked one day when most of the girls were together in the schoolroom. "No, never," cried a number of voices. "Have you got one? Oh, do let us see it." "Certainly, I'll get it right away if you like," said Rose obligingly. She went to her room and returned with a shabby old blank book in her hand. Some of the girls looked disappointed. "The cover of mine isn't very nice," explained Rose. "I'm going to have it rebound one of these days. You see, it's not a new album at all, nor a school album, but it's very valuable to me." Here she heaved a sentimental sigh. "All my friends have written in it," she said. The girls were quite impressed by the manner in which Rose said this. But when they turned over the pages of the album they were even more impressed. Rose had evidently been on intimate terms with a circle of most distinguished persons. Half the autographs in the book were from gentlemen, and they were dated all over the world. "Just listen to this," cried Louisa, and she read, "Thou mayst forget me, but never, never shall I forget thee, Alfonso of Castile. The Escurial, April 1st." "Who's he?" asked a circle of awestruck girls. "Didn't you ever hear of him? Youngest brother of the King of Spain," replied Rose carelessly. "Oh, my, and just hear this!" exclaimed Annie Silsby. "If you ever deign to cast a thought in my direction, Miss Rose, remember me always as thy devoted servitor, Potemkin Montmorency. St. Petersburg, July 10th. "And this!" shrieked Alice White. "They say love is a thorn, I say it is a dart, and yet I cannot tear thee from my heart. Antonio, Count of Vallombrosa." "Do you really and truly know a count?" asked Bella, backing away from Rose with eyes big as saucers. "Know Antonio de Vallombrosa? I should think I did," replied Rose. "Nobody in this country knows him so well, I fancy." "And he wrote that for you?" "How else could it get into my book, goosey?" This was unanswerable, and Rose was installed from that time forward in the minds of Bella and the rest as a heroine of the first water. Katy, however, knew better, and the first time she caught Rose alone she attacked her on the subject. "Now, Rosy Posy, confess. Who wrote all those absurd autographs in your book?" "Absurd autographs? What can you mean?" "All those counts and things. No, it's no use. You shan't wriggle away until you tell me." "Oh, Antonio and dear Potemkin, do you mean them?" "Yes, of course I do." "And you really want to know?" "Yes." "And will swear not to tell?" "Yes." "Well, then," bursting into a laugh, "I wrote every one of them myself." "Did you really? When?" "Day before yesterday. I thought Lily needed taking down, she was so set up with her autographs of Wendell Phillips and Mr. Seward, so I just sat down and wrote a bookful. It only took me half an hour. I meant to write some more. In fact, I had one all ready. I am dead or pretty near, David's done for me, I fear, Goliath of Gath. But I was afraid even Bella wouldn't swallow that, so I tore out the page. I'm sorry I did now, for I really think the geese would have believed it. Written in his last moments, you know, to oblige an ancestor of my own," added Rose in a tone of explanation. "You monkey!" cried Katy, highly diverted. But she kept Rose's counsel, and I dare say some of the Hillsover girls believe in that wonderful album to this day. It was not long after that a sad piece of news came for Bella. Her father was dead. Their home was in Iowa, too far to allow of her returning for the funeral, so the poor little girl stayed at school, to bear her trouble as best she might. Katy, who was always kind to children, and had somewhat affected Bella from the first on account of her resemblance to Elsie in height and figure, was especially tender to her now, which Bella repaid with the gift of her whole queer little heart. Her affectionate demonstrations were rather of the monkey order, and not unfrequently troublesome, but Katy was never otherwise than patient and gentle with her, though Rose, and even Clover, remonstrated on what they called this singular intimacy. "Poor little soul! It's so hard for her, and she's only 11 years old," she told them. "She has such a funny way of looking at you sometimes," said Rose, who was very observant. "It is just the air of a squirrel who has hidden a nut, and doesn't want you to find out where, and yet can hardly keep indicating it with his paw. She's got something on her mind, I'm sure." "Half a dozen things, very likely," added Clover. "She's such a mischief." But none of them guessed what this something was. Early in January Mrs. Nipson announced that in 4 weeks she proposed to give a soiree to which all young ladies whose records were entirely free from marks during the intervening period would be allowed to come. This announcement created great excitement, and the school set itself to be good. But marks were easy to get, and gradually one girl after another lost her chance, till by the appointed day only a limited party descended to join the festivities, and nearly half the school was left upstairs to sigh over past sins. Katy and Rose were among the unlucky ones. Rose had incurred a mark by writing a note in study hour, and Katy by being 5 minutes late to dinner. They consoled themselves by dressing Clover's hair and making her look as pretty as possible, and then stationed themselves in the upper hall at the head of the stairs to watch her career and get as much fun out of the occasion as they could. Pretty soon they saw Clover below on Professor Seacombe's arm. He was a kingly, pleasant man with a bald head, and it was a fashion among the girls to admire him. "Doesn't she look pretty?" said Rose. "Just notice Mrs. Searles, Katy. She's grinning at Clover like the Cheshire cat. What a wonderful cap that is of hers. She had it when Sylvia was here at school 8 years ago." "Hush! She'll hear you." "No, she won't. There's Ellen beginning her piece. I know she's frightened by the way she plays. Hark how she hurries the time." "There, they are going to have refreshments after all," cried Esther Dearborn, as trays of lemonade and cake baskets appeared below on their way to the parlor. "Isn't it a shame to have to stay up here?" "Professor Seacombe! Professor!" called Rose in a daring whisper. "Take pity upon us. We are starving for a piece of cake." The professor gave a jump, then retreated and looked upward. When he saw the circle of hungry faces peering down, he doubled up with laughter. "Wait a moment," he whispered back, and vanished into the parlor. Pretty soon the girls saw him making his way through the crowd with an immense slice of pound cake in each hand. "Here, Miss Rose," he said. "Catch it." but Rose ran halfway downstairs, received the cake, dimpled her thanks, and retreated to the darkness above, whence sounds proceeded which sent the amused professor into the parlor convulsed with suppressed laughter. Pretty soon Clover stole up the back stairs to report. "Are you having a nice time? Is the lemonade good? Who have you been talking with?" inquired a chorus of voices. "Pretty nice. Everybody is old. I haven't been talking to anybody in particular, and the lemonade is only cream of tartar water. I guess it's jollier up here with you," replied Clover. "I must go now. My turn to play comes next." Down she ran. "Except for the glory of the thing, I think we're having more fun than she," answered Rose. Next week came St. Valentine's Day. Several of the girls received valentines from home, and they wrote them to each other. Katy and Clover both had one from Phil, exactly alike, with the same purple bird in the middle of the page and "I love you" printed underneath; and they joined in fabricating a gorgeous one for Rose, which was supposed to come from Potemkin de Montmorency, the hero of the album. But the most surprising valentine was received by Miss Jane. It came with the others while all the household were at dinner. The girls saw her redden and look angry, but she put the letter in her pocket and said nothing. In the afternoon it came out through Bella that Miss Jane's letter was in poetry, and that she was just as mad as fire about it. Just before tea Louisa came running down the row to number 5, where Katy was sitting with Rose. "Girls, what do you think? That letter which Miss Jane got this morning was a valentine. The most dreadful thing, but so funny!" She stopped to laugh. "How do you know?" cried the other two. "Miss Marsh told Alice Gibbons. She's a sort of cousin, you know, and Miss Marsh often tells her things. She says Miss Jane and Mrs. Nipson are furious and are determined to find out who sent it. It was from Mr. Hardhack, Miss Jane's missionary. Or no, not from Mr. Hardhack, but from a cannibal who had just eaten Mr. Hardhack up, and he sent Miss Jane a lock of his hair and the recipe the tribe cooked him by. They found him very nice, he said, and he turned out quite tender. That was one of the lines in the poem. Did you ever hear of anything like it? Who do you suppose could have sent it?" "Who could it have been?" cried the others. Katy had one moment's awful misgiving, but a glance at Rose's face, calm and innocent as a baby's, reassured her. It was impossible that she could have done this mischievous thing. Katy, you see, was not privy to that entry in Rose's journal, "Pay Miss Jane off," nor aware that Rose had just written underneath, "Did it, February 14th, 1869." Nobody ever found out the author of this audacious valentine. Rose kept her own counsel, and Miss Jane probably concluded that the better part of valor was discretion, for the threatened inquiries were never made. And now it lacked but 6 weeks to the end of the term. The girls counted the days and practiced various devices to make them pass more quickly. Esther Dearborn, who had a turn for arithmetic, set herself to a careful calculation of how many hours, minutes, and seconds must pass before the happy time should come. Annie Silsby strung 42 tiny squares of cardboard on a thread, and each night slipped one off and burned it up in the candle. Others made diagrams of the time with a division for each day, and every night blotted one out with a sense of triumph. None of these devices made the time hasten. It never moved more slowly than now, when life seemed to consist of a universal waiting. But though Katy's heart bounded at the thought of home till she could hardly bear the gladness, she owned to Clover, "Do you know, much as I long to get away, I'm half sorry to go. It is parting with something which we shall never have any more. Home is lovely, and I would rather be there than anywhere else. But if you and I live to be 100, we shall never be girls at boarding school again." End of chapter 12. Katy Did at School. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, June 2007. What Katy Did at School by Susan Coolidge. Chapter 13. Paradise Regained. "Only 7 days more to cross off," said Clover, drawing her pencil through one of the squares on the diagram pinned beside her looking-glass. 7 more, and then, oh, joy! Papa will be here, and we shall start for home." She was interrupted by the entrance of Katy, holding a letter and looking pale and aggrieved. "Oh, Clover," she cried, "just listen to this. Papa can't come for us. Isn't it too bad?" And she read, "Burnett, March 20th. My dear girls, I find that it will not be possible for me to come for you next week as I intended. Several people are severely ill, and old Mrs. Barlow struck down suddenly with paralysis, so I cannot leave. I am sorry, and so will you be, but there is no help for it. Fortunately, Mrs. Hall has just heard that some friends of hers are coming westward with their family, and she has written to ask them to take charge of you. The drawback to this plan is that you will have to travel alone as far as Albany, where Mr. Peters, Mrs. Hall's friend, will meet you. I have written to ask Mr. Paige to put you on the train, and under the care of the conductor, on Tuesday morning. I hope you will get through without embarrassment. Mr. Peters will be at the station in Albany to receive you, or if anything should hinder him, you are to drive at once to the Delavan House, where they are staying. I enclose a check for your journey. If Dorry were 5 years older, I should send him after you. The children are most impatient to have you back. Miss Finch has been suddenly called away by the illness of her sister-in-law, so Elsie is keeping house till you return. God bless you, my dear daughters, and send you safe. Yours affectionately, P. Carr. "Oh, dear," said Clover, with her lip trembling. "Now papa won't see Rosie." "No," said Katy, "and Rosie and Louisa and the rest won't see him. That is the worst of all. I wanted them to so much. And just think how dismal it will be to travel with people we don't know. It's too bad, I declare." "I do think old Mrs. Barlow might have put off being ill just 1 week longer," grumbled Clover. "It takes away half the pleasure of going home." The girls might be excused for being cross, for this was a great disappointment. There was no help for it, however, as papa said. They could only sigh and submit. But the journey, to which they had looked forward so much, was no longer thought of as a pleasure, only a disagreeable necessity, something which must be endured in order that they might reach home. 5, 4, 3 days. The last little square was crossed off. The last dinner was eaten. The last breakfast. There was much mourning over Katy and Clover among the girls who were to return for another year. Louisa and Ellen Gray were inconsolable, and Bella, with a very small pocket handkerchief held tightly in her hand, clung to Katy every moment, crying, and declaring that she would not let her go. The last evening she followed her into number 2, where she was dreadfully in the way of the packing, and, after various odd contortions and mysterious half-spoken sentences, said, "Say, won't you tell if I tell you something?" "What is it?" asked Katy absently, as she folded and smoothed her best gown. "Something," repeated Bella, wagging her head mysteriously and looking more like a thievish squirrel than ever. "Well, what is it? Tell me." To Katy's surprise, Bella burst into a violent fit of crying. "I'm real sorry I did it," she sobbed. "Real sorry. And now you'll never love me any more." "Yes, I will. What is it? Do stop crying, Bella dear, and tell me," said Katy, alarmed at the violence of the sobs.
"It was for fun. Really and truly it was. But I wanted some cake, too," protested Bella, sniffing very hard.
"What?"
"And I didn't think anybody would know. Barry Searles doesn't care a bit for us little girls, only for big ones, and I knew if I said Bella he'd never give me the cake, so I said Miss Carr instead."
"Bella, did you write that note?" inquired Katy, almost too much surprised to speak.
"Yes, and I tied a string to your blind because I knew I could go in and draw it up when you were practicing. But I didn't mean to do any harm, and when Mrs. Florence was so mad and changed your room I was real sorry," moaned Bella, digging her knuckles into her eyes. "Won't you ever love me any more?" she demanded. Katy lifted her into her lap and talked so tenderly and seriously that her contrition, which was only half genuine, became real, and she cried in good earnest when Katy kissed her in token of forgiveness. "Of course you'll go at once to Mrs. Nipson," said Clover and Rose when Katy imparted this surprising discovery. "No, I think not. Why should I? It would only get poor little Bella into a dreadful scrape, and she's coming back again, you know. Mrs. Nipson does not believe that story now. Nobody does. We had lived it down, just as I hoped we should. That is much better than having it contradicted." "I don't think so, and I should enjoy seeing that little wretch of a Bella well whipped," persisted Rose. But Katy was not to be shaken. "To please me, promise that not a word shall be said about it," she urged. And, to please her, the girls consented. I think Katy was right in saying that Mrs. Nipson no longer believed her guilty in the affair of the note. She had been very friendly to both the sisters of late, and when Clover carried in her album and asked for an autograph, she waxed quite sentimental and wrote, "I would not exchange the modest Clover for the most beautiful parterre, so bring it back, I pray thee, to your affectionate teacher, Mary Ann Nipson," which effusion quite overwhelmed the modest Clover, and called out the remark from Rose, "Don't she wish she may get you?" Miss Jane said twice, "I shall miss you, Katy," a speech which, to quote Rose again, made Katy look as surprised as Balaam. Rose herself was not coming back to school. She and the girls were half broken-hearted at parting. They lavished tears, kisses, promises of letters, and vows of eternal friendship. Neither of them, it was agreed, was ever to love anybody else so well. The final moment would have been almost too tragical had it not been for a last bit of mischief on the part of Rose.
It was after the stage was actually at the door, and she had her foot on the step, that, struck by a happy thought, she rushed upstairs again, collected the girls, and each taking a window, they tore down the cotton, flung open the sashes, and startled Mrs. Nipson, who stood below, by the simultaneous waving therefrom of many white flags. Katy, who was already in the stage, had the full benefit of this performance. Always after that, when she thought of the nunnery, her memory recalled this scene: Mrs. Nipson in the doorway, Bella blubbering behind, and overhead the windows crowded with saucy girls, laughing and triumphantly flapping the long cotton strips which had for so many months obscured the daylight for them all. At Springfield next morning she and Clover said good-bye to Mr. Paige and Lily. The ride to Albany was easy and safe. With every mile their spirits rose. At last they were actually on the way home. At Albany they looked anxiously about the crowded depot for Mr. Peters. Nobody appeared at first, and they had time to grow nervous before they saw a gentle, careworn little man coming toward them in company with the conductor. "I believe you are the young ladies I have come to meet," he said. "You must excuse my being late. I was detained by business. There is a great deal to do to move a family out west." He wiped his forehead in a dispirited way. Then he put the girls into a carriage and gave the driver a direction. "We'd better leave your baggage at the office as we pass," he said, "because we have to get off so early in the morning." "How early?" "The boat goes at 6, but we ought to be on board by 5:30 so as to be well settled before she starts." "The boat?" said Katy, opening her eyes. "Oh, yes. Erie Canal, you know. Our furniture goes that way, so we judged it best to do the same and keep an eye on it ourselves. Never be separated from your property if you can help it. That's my maxim. It's the Prairie Belle, one of the finest boats on the canal." "When do we get to Buffalo?" asked Katy, with an uneasy recollection of having heard that canal boats travel slowly. "Buffalo? Let me see. This is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Well, if we're lucky we ought to be there Friday evening, so if we're not too late to catch the night boat on the lake you'll reach home Saturday afternoon." 4 days! The girls looked at each other with dismay too deep for words. Elsie was expecting them by Thursday at latest. What should they do? Telegraph was the only answer that suggested itself. So Katy scribbled a despatch, coming by canal, don't expect us till Saturday, which she begged Mr. Peters to send. And she and Clover agreed in whispers that it was dreadful, but they must bear it as patiently as they could. Oh, the patience which is needed on a canal! The motion which is not so much motion as standing still! The crazy impulse to jump out and help the crawling boat along by pushing it from behind! How one grows to hate the slow, monotonous glide, the dull banks, and to envy every swift-moving thing in sight, each man on horseback, each bird flying through the air. Mrs. Peters was a thin, anxious woman who spent her life anticipating disasters of all sorts. She had her children with her, 3 little boys and a teething baby, and such a load of bundles and baskets and brown paper parcels that Katy and Clover privately wondered how she could possibly have got through the journey without their help. Willie, the eldest boy, was always begging leave to go ashore and ride the towing horses. Sammy, the second, could only be kept quiet by means of crooked pins and fish lines of blue yarn, while Paul, the youngest, was possessed with a curiosity as to the underside of the boat, which resulted in his dropping his new hat overboard 5 times in 3 days, Mr. Peters and the cabin boy rowing back in a small boat each time to recover it. Mrs. Peters sat on deck with her baby in her lap, and was in a perpetual agony lest the lock should work wrongly, or the boys be drowned, or someone fail to notice the warning cry "Bridge!" and have their heads carried off from their shoulders. Nobody did, but the poor lady suffered the anguish of 10 accidents in dreading the one which never took place. The berths at night were small and cramped, restless children woke and cried, the cabins were close, the decks cold and windy. There was nothing to see and nothing to do. Katy and Clover agreed that they never wanted to see a canal boat again. They were helpful to Mrs. Peters, amused the boys, and kept them out of mischief, and she told her husband that she really thought she shouldn't have lived through the journey if it hadn't been for the Miss Carrs. They were such kind girls and so fond of children. But the 3 days were terribly long. At last they ended. Buffalo was reached in time for the lake boat, and once established on board, feeling the rapid motion and knowing that each stroke of the paddles took them nearer home, the girls were rewarded for their long trial of patience. At 4 o'clock the next afternoon Burnett was in sight. Long before they touched the wharf Clover discovered old Whitey and the carryall and Alexander waiting for them among the crowd of carriages. Standing on the edge of the dock appeared a well-known figure. "Papa! Papa!" she shrieked. It seemed as if the girls could not wait for the boat to stop and the plank to be lowered. How delightful it was to feel papa again, such a sense of home and comfort and shelter as came with his touch. "I'll never go away from you again. Never, never," repeated Clover, keeping tight hold of his hand as they drove up the hill. Dr. Carr, as he gazed at his girls, was equally happy. They were so bright, affectionate, and loving. No, he could never spare them again, for the boarding school or anything else, he thought. "You must be very tired," he said. "Not a bit. I'm hardly ever tired now," replied Katy. "Oh, dear, I forgot to thank Mr. Peters for taking care of us," said Clover. "Never mind, I did it for you," answered her father. "Oh, that baby," she continued. "How glad I am it has gone to Toledo, and I needn't hear it cry any more. Katy, Katy, there's home! We're at the gate!" The girls looked eagerly out, but no children were visible. They hurried up the gravel path, under the locust boughs just beginning to bud. There, over the front door, was an arch of evergreens, with Katy and Clover upon it in scarlet letters, and as they reached the porch the door flew open and out poured the children in a tumultuous little crowd. They had been on the roof, looking through a spyglass after the boat. "We never knew you had come until we heard the gate," explained John and Dorry, while Elsie hugged Clover and Phil, locking his arms around Katy's neck, took his feet off the floor and swung them in an ecstasy of affection until she begged for mercy. "How you are grown! Dorry, you're as tall as I am! Elsie, darling, how well you look! Oh, isn't it delicious, delicious, delicious to be at home again?" There was such a hubbub of endearments and explanations that Dr. Carr could hardly make himself heard. "Clover, your waist has grown as small as a pin. You look just like the beautiful princess in Elsie's story," said Johnny. "Take the girls into the parlor," repeated Dr. Carr. "It is cold out here with the door open." "Take 'em upstairs. You don't know what is upstairs," shouted Phil, whereupon Elsie frowned and shook her head at him. The parlor was gay with daffodils and hyacinths in vases of blue violets which smelt delightfully. Cecy had helped arrange them, Elsie said, and just at that moment Cecy herself came in. Her hair was arranged in a sort of pincushion of puffs with a row of curls on top, where no curls used to grow, and her appearance generally was very fine and fashionable, but she was the same affectionate Cecy as ever, and hugged the girls and danced round them as she used to do at 12. She had waited until they had had time to kiss once all round, she said, and then she really couldn't wait any longer. "Now come upstairs," suggested Elsie when Clover had warmed her feet and the flowers had been admired, and everybody had said 10 times over how nice it was to have the girls back, and the girls had replied that it was just as nice to come back. So they all went upstairs, Elsie leading the way. "Where are you going?" cried Katy. "That's the blue room." But Elsie did not pause. "You see," she explained, with the doorknob in her hand, "Papa and I thought you ought to have a bigger room now, because you are grown-up young ladies. So we have fixed this for you, and your old one is going to be the spare room instead." Then she threw the door open and led the girls in. "See, Katy," she said, "this is your bureau, and this is Clover's. And look what nice drawers Papa has had put in the closet. 2 for you and 2 for her. Aren't they convenient? Don't you like it? And isn't it a great deal pleasanter than the old room?" "Oh, a great deal," cried the girls. "It is delightful, everything about it." All Katy's old treasures had been transferred from her old quarters to this. There was her cushioned chair, her table, her bookshelf, the pictures from the walls. There were some new things, too. A blue carpet, blue paper on the walls, window curtains of fresh chintz, and Elsie had made a tasteful pincushion for each bureau, and Johnny crocheted mats for the washstand. Altogether it was as pretty a bower as 2 sisters just grown into ladies could desire. "What are those lovely things hanging on either side of the bed?" asked Clover. They were 2 illuminated texts, sent as a welcome home by Cousin Helen. One was a morning text and the other an evening text, Elsie explained. The evening text, which bore the words, "I will lay me down to sleep and take my rest, for it is thou, Lord, only, who makest me dwell in safety," was painted in soft purples and grays, and among the poppies and silver lilies which wreathed it appeared a cunning little downy bird fast asleep with his head under his wing. The morning text, "When I awake I am still with thee," was in bright colors, scarlet and blue and gold, and had a frame of rose garlands and wide-awake-looking butterflies and hummingbirds. The girls thought they had never seen anything so pretty. Such a gay supper as they had that night. Katy would not take her old place at the tea tray. She wanted to know how Elsie looked as housekeeper, she said. So she sat on one side of Papa and Clover on the other, and Elsie poured the tea with a mixture of delight and dignity which was worth seeing. "I'll begin tomorrow," said Katy. And with that morrow, when she came out of her pretty room and took her place once more as manager of the household, her grown-up life may be said to have begun. So it is time that I should cease to write about her. Grown-up lives may be very interesting, but they have no rightful place in a child's book. If little girls will forget to be little and take it upon them to become young ladies, they must bear the consequences, one of which is that we can follow their fortunes no longer. I wrote these last words sitting in the same green meadow where the first words of What Katy Did were written. A year had passed, but a cardinal flower which seemed the same stood looking at itself in the brook, and from the bulrush bed sounded tiny voices. My little goggle-eyed friends were discussing Katy and her conduct, as they did then, but with less spirit; for one voice came seldom and faintly, while the other, bold and defiant as ever, repeated over and over again, "Katy didn't! Katy didn't! She didn't! "Katy did," sounded faintly from the farther rush. "She didn't! She didn't!" chirped the undaunted partisan. Silence followed. His opponent was either convinced or tired of the discussion. Katy didn't. The words repeated themselves in my mind as I walked homeward. How much room for didn'ts there is in the world, I thought. What an important part they play. And how glad I am that, with all her own and other people's doings, so many of these didn'ts were included among the things which my Katy did at school. End of chapter 13. End of What Katy Did at School.